All right. Well, I love these conversations from time to time. We are going through a series and we pause or we come to a natural break in the series, which gives us an opportunity to kind of have a conversation about where we've been and perhaps what we've learned. And this might surprise you, but this is 100% true, is that we always learn more than we're able to share on Sunday mornings. And the reason for that is a great orator in the, I'm going to say the 20th century, although I always get those confused, said that people's minds can only absorb what their posteriors can endure. All right, so you may get that in a little bit. Basically the longer you talk, the less people listen. That's kind of the summation of that. And so we try to do the running joke is, as each teaching is 25 minutes. Now, if you've ever come to church here, you understand why that's a joke, right? Because when we get 35 minutes, we actually pat each other on the back. That's what we do. Because every week we tear apart the sermon and put it up on YouTube. And so I always tell Shawn, 33 minutes. 33 minutes. Believe it or not, I am shorter than Shawn. He has a problem.
To be under 40.
I was going to say, he has a problem being under 40.
Yeah, I do.
So, yeah.
I do have a problem being under 40.
And the reason for that is because we are learning so much that we have to cut out so much information just to get it to that length. If you saw our notes, what you would see, and I know Shawn manuscripts a lot of his, but if you saw my notes, you would have a big, long notes that I'll teach to you. There will be a line below it, and then there will be a whole bunch more information below it. And so every week, my father-in-law, who I very rarely call my father-in-law, but my dad, is Dad on right now? Okay, so he will send me a text on Sunday. Send me your notes. Dad, there are no notes today. All right, just want to let you know, there are no notes today. And so I don't know what you're going to do. We'll have to figure that out when I see you. But there.
I have a little bit of notes.
You have a little bit of notes? Oh.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 lines of notes.
40
I'm winging it.
40 minutes.
Yeah.
40 minutes for sure.
I think I'd be longer if I didn't manuscript. That's one of the reasons I manuscript.
Just to keep you shorter?
To keep me shorter.
Yeah,
because if I'm just thinking on stage, it will be wandering.
I do that.
Yeah.
Well.
Yeah, true.
Yeah.
True. But I'm a little slower.
Just because you wander does not mean you're lost, though.
Yes, that's true.
So, yeah.
That is true.
Yeah. All right. So we are wrapping up our teaching on the Gospel of Mark, the area where we've been talking about the miracles of Mark. Most of those miracles have fallen between Mark's Gospel chapter 4 and Mark's Gospel chapter number 10. And there's a reason for that. This seems to be the bulk of Mark's teaching about, the bulk of Jesus' teaching falls in this area. Mark chapter 11, Jesus begins the last week he's alive. All right? So 1/3 of Mark's gospel is dealing with basically 10, 12, 14 days. And primarily the last 7 days of Jesus that he's in Jerusalem, which we would call Holy Week. All right? And so that's what Mark deals with. And it's kind of a lot of text about the journey to the cross. And so that's kind of why we divided it up this way. But this has been super excited. So I'm wondering, Shawn, we talked about what questions we kind of wanted to ask each other and talk about. But what was your favorite miracle that we talked about or didn't talk about in Mark's gospel? You got to leave out Matthew, John, and Luke. So
right. That was one of the difficult parts about teaching on the miracles was we had all these miracles in our mind, but not all of them are recorded by Mark. Right. So there's a lot more things that Jesus said and did that don't fit inside of Mark. So the first thing we had to do is figure out which ones of our favorite were actually in the book, because the 4 gospels kind of meld together and you get this more holistic picture of Jesus. That's why we have 4 of them instead of just one. But my favorite miracle was with the Syrophoenician woman.
Yeah,
that's my favorite miracle because I'm always excited when the gospel writers portray Jesus' sense of irony. And so in that miracle, this woman who's the first thing that we're told about this woman is that she's Greek. And that's the first thing we're told. Basically, the important thing about that is that she's not Jewish, right? And she comes to Jesus while Jesus is eating, asks for healing, and then Jesus says something like really striking to her, and she says, it's not right for dogs to eat the bread that the children are given. And so he basically calls her a dog, but what Jesus is kind of doing there is taking on this popular thought, this popular mode of thinking that Jewish people of that day thought, very prejudiced idea that Gentiles were less than. And so Jesus as a Jew is not literally calling her a dog, but saying, he's almost taking on like a mask and saying this is kind of what a normal person, a normal Jewish teacher would respond with. And she kind of plays along. And she says, well, even the dogs can eat the crumbs that fall off of the table. And so it's a very witty story where both she and Jesus are kind of making these ironic statements. And of course, Jesus is struck by her faith, which is a theme in the Gospel of Mark, is the faith of these people that ask for healing, many of whom are women. And she's healed of her sickness. So that's probably my favorite one that we talked about.
Yeah, mine too, without question. And I think because the deeper you begin to look at what's going on, the more complex it becomes. And and I think the more relevant it becomes as well. Because even though we live in a world that's constantly talking about unity and uniting and all this kind of stuff, we still have a great amount of division between us and them. Now, however you label them, right? And that's the problem. Those on the inside and those on the outside. And I think it's easier for us as Americans to do this because we only have two neighbors. We have Canada and we have Mexico, right? But if you were in Europe, you could potentially have all of these neighbors that are there. And in the Middle East where Jesus was, he had, a whole bunch of different clans and tribes and nations at that time, Even though they were all under the Roman rule, right? There were still different cultures and customs, and I think it's super applicable to us today. And so I thought it's still one of my favorite stories. I'm still learning from it.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things about that story too is that it takes place as Jesus is on his way from Galilee to Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And so the way that Israel was set up, because it was under Roman occupation, there was this little territory of Israel. It was the hill country, it was like where the Podunk people lived. That's where Jesus was from, up in Galilee, up in the north.
Podunk.
Yeah, it was. It was seen like that, and it was like up there, and they lived up there. And in between there and Jerusalem, which is kind of the traditional, like this is what we think of when we think of Israel,
right. There
was a lot of Gentile territory. And so Jesus was actually traveling through. That story takes place in Tyre and Sidon, which is not... It's not really Jewish territory where Jesus is right here. And so it makes it even more striking. Like the story is even more striking because he's not even in his homeland per se. He's on his way to Jerusalem, and then this story just happens. And so Jesus is constantly surrounded by, it's not like it was today where we have very clear-cut boundaries of what town is what, under Roman occupation. There was a lot of mixing, and there were a lot of different people. They were right in the Mediterranean Sea. There's a lot of trade happening and stuff around where Jesus is traveling on this trade route to get to Jerusalem. And on the way, we get this beautiful story about how Jesus interacts with Gentiles, and almost by parodying the normal us versus them, Jesus is actually dismantling the idea of us versus them, and teaching the people looking on, both in the story and today, that we've got to take down those walls, that everybody matters and that everybody is worthy of Jesus, and that everybody is capable of the faith that leads you to a relationship with Jesus.
Right. And your nationality, us and them, doesn't matter when it comes to coming to Jesus. I think that's a powerful statement. So let's go back even a little further then, because all the miracles that are there. A couple we didn't talk about. Blind Bartimaeus, we didn't talk about him. We didn't talk about Jesus really walking on the water, although we used that story to highlight something else. There's a lot of them. So as you study the miracles, why does it seem like the gospel writers, why do they use miracles in their explaining who Jesus is?
Yeah, so the first place that I went when I was thinking about this question is actually from a story that's not in Mark. So I'll just mention it briefly. Is that
that's extra time.
I know. So there's this moment in one of the other Gospels where Jesus encounters somebody who's blind, and the Pharisees are like, who was it that was responsible for him being blind? Did he sin? Did his parents sin? What happened? And Jesus is like, it has nothing to do with who sinned or who didn't sin. This has become an opportunity for me to show the power of God in this moment and to prove that I am the Son of God. And so I think that's a really great way to look at what is happening when Jesus does miracles. They're an opportunity for him to show off, not just for fun, but to show off that he is who he says he is, and that he's come to do what he says that he can do. And so an example of this in Mark is actually what we talked about earlier in the beginning of the year. The second series that we did in Mark had to do with this word power and authority.
Right.
And right away after Jesus is baptized, he immediately starts teaching, and people are like, who is this guy that has power, that teaches with power, with authority, not like the other teachers that we know? Right. And then right after that, we get another example of him delivering somebody from being possessed. And it says, what power does this guy have that he even commands the demons? And so the miracles of Jesus are an opportunity to show his power and authority, and ultimately to say the only one who could have this kind of power and authority is somebody who's anointed by God.
Right. And I think we see that demonstrated not just from the religious side, but also in the story of the centurion who came to Jesus, and he said to Jesus, listen, you don't even have to come. Just speak the words, and my daughter will be healed. Basically, his thought was, Jesus, you have power over even the elements of the air. They have to obey you because of what's going on. And so, yeah, I think that's just a powerful reminder of that. I like that too, but you know what I thought when I was thinking about it? I love the fact that when the miracles happen, there's this phrase that happens over and over and over again. And it happens at the feeding of the 4,000. It happens through different miracles. And it says, and Jesus moved with compassion. And that phrase is so powerful because oftentimes we forget how compassionate Jesus was, that his heart was genuinely moved for people. And that makes sense because the foundational character of God is that of love. God is love, right? And then even in John's, since you already took us there, John chapter 3, verse 16, for God so loved the world, right? And yet we see that on display over and over again because Jesus had compassion on the crowd that was hungry, and he didn't want to send them home because he knew that they'd been there for multiple days and they would faint in the way, and his compassion is on display over and over and over again. And so I from the very beginning, the first sermon I preached on the miracles, I said this. I said, his power always flowed from his deep love for people. And if you don't love people, then I don't think you'll be able to be a conduit of God's power in their heart and life, right? If your mindset is not, how can I love you? How can I bless you? Then your motives will always be other than God's, right? And so particularly in religious circles, even in work circles, it's the same one. It's not, how can I benefit you, but how can I use you? And I think that's contrasted with Jesus often because he's not using people to get what he wants. And the reason is that he has everything that he needs, right? And if that's true of Jesus, it's also true of us, even when we don't recognize it, right? If you have Jesus, you have enough, right? And so I don't need to use other people, but I can bless and love other people. And can I just say, what a difference it would make, and I'm not talking about people who are outside the church, I'm talking about people inside the church. What a difference would it make if people inside the church would love one another and those who are outside the church in the way Jesus loved people? That would be revolutionary. It would be. And so Jesus is demonstrating for us a little bit of his heart, not so that we can be a recipient of his love, we are, but also so that we can be an example of his love, a conduit through which his love flows. And we kind of see that as we continue to go through the Gospels and we go into the book of Acts. We're going to see how that continues to be, the disciples become a conduit of his love. When they get it. They struggle to get it, though. And we're going to talk about that in the teachings because they struggle with this identity that the teachings of Jesus was just for them. So do we. That the benefits of Jesus are just for us. No. Jesus is for us, but he needs to work his way through us to other people so that you and I act and become more a little bit like Jesus. And so I think his compassion, his power, his glory, his authority, I think all these are wrapped up into this idea of why miracles. And what it did, what it provided for Jesus was people thronged to him. Right? Where's Jesus at? Right? It was like, where's Jesus at? That's where I want to be. Where's Jesus at? That's where I want to be. Makes me think. I'm traveling now, right? Yeah. It makes me think, if we were doing this, would the world then say, where are those Christians gathering today? That's where I want to be. By the way, that's what happens in the book of Acts. People wanted to be where the Christians were because they were so drawn to not just Christians, but to Christ in people. And that's the explosive nature of living this like Jesus lived. And so I think that's the powerful lesson that we can take from the miracles.
Yeah, there's a way. I was listening to a podcast on Romans this week, and it struck me. And the more New Testament books you dive into, you realize that the whole New Testament, every single book in the New Testament, is telling one story, and that's at the center of it. And the epistles, especially, like the letters that are written after Acts, are about getting the churches to put this into practice. And that one unified story that the New Testament tells, that there's a new king who's setting up a new kingdom, and in that kingdom, all these barriers that people put up between themselves, all the us versus thems, are done away with. The whole New Testament is basically about not being prejudiced towards one another. Every single letter, especially of Paul, is about stop dividing over all this different stuff, especially the Jew-Gentile, because that was the main issue within the church and within the Israelite culture of Jesus' day, right? It's this Jew-Gentile distinction. But it's more than that, too, because there's slave and free distinctions from that. There's also male and female distinctions that the church just continues to struggle with. And you realize that Jesus' message was new king, new kingdom, and in that kingdom, we're all united as one family, one body, right? One vine, all these different metaphors that Jesus uses and that are picked up by the New Testament writers. That is the whole story. And for some reason, the church then and today just can't get it.
Yeah. And the Roman Empire, which was the kingdom of the world in that day, they did not care if the Jews hated Samaritans.
Right.
Or if the Jews hated Gentiles.
They were kind
as
of
long
encouraging
as you paid, as long as you paid your taxes,
Yeah.
and you gave them a reason to have a military force there,
Right. Right.
Yeah. So this is a totally different kingdom of a totally different nature
Yeah.
that's not based upon boundaries of lines of nations, not based upon military strength. It's based upon who we are in Christ, and the whole identity is, if I represent Christ well, people will be drawn to Christ. And it has a motto of learning to treat others without any hypocrisy or love without discrimination, I like to say. So
that's really good.
Absolutely.
Another thing I was thinking about while you were talking was just many of the miracles that Jesus does that we've talked about so far are interruptions to Jesus.
Yeah.
This is a huge thing for me because it's something that I struggle with, is allowing yourself to be interrupted by what's going on. We would think if we were trying to get the news out there, right, we might set up an event and invite people to it, and we might try to put on like this big production, or we might try to do announcements or advertising. Jesus didn't do any of that. What happened or at least in the Gospel of Mark, what's recorded for us, almost every story in Mark is this incidental thing that happens to Jesus. Like, he is going to the synagogues, he's reading scripture, he's teaching, all that stuff, he's traveling, he's doing healings, right? But many of the stories that we discussed are these moments where Jesus is doing one thing, and then this person is an interruption. You can think about that all the way going back to the beginning, where the first miracle that we discussed, or the first, I should say, healing that we discussed, is when they rip the roof off of the house that Jesus is in, right? And they lower down their friend who is paralyzed, and Jesus brings healing to them. And that story, you know, and I remember reading, and a lot of scholars think that roof that was ripped off was Jesus' own house, because it's in his hometown, and he's teaching out of this random house. And so some people have said, you know, it doesn't explicitly say that it was Jesus, but I like to think that even if it was Jesus' own house, even if his own roof that got destroyed, Jesus is a master at using these interruptions as opportunities to bring about his power, and also to offer really important teaching for us as well. And even in that story, he offers like really, really solid teaching there. I think of the feeding of the 5,000, the disciples had just come back from their missions journey. They're going out into the wilderness for rest, right? And all of a sudden, these thousands of people hear this is where Jesus is going. They're flocking to him. Everybody's tired, right? And that's why it says that Jesus has compassion on them. Because he saw them and they looked like they were sheep without a shepherd. Is how some of the Gospels talk about it. And another one that I can think of is the story where he's going to heal the temple leader's daughter, right? And then there's this Gentile woman with the issue of bleeding who walks up and touches Jesus in the crowd, and Jesus stops and has this interaction with her. And while Jesus is having the interaction with this woman, this other man's daughter dies, and It's an interesting story to say Jesus values these people that interrupt his schedule so much, and he uses the same word, this daughter language, to talk about this woman who's unclean. And we talked about what a striking thing that would have been for her who's unclean, but also just to say, hey, I know I have this other daughter who's sick, but this daughter kind of interrupts, and then of course Jesus goes and raises the daughter from the dead anyway. But this idea of being willing to be interrupted. But then also to use those as opportunities to teach about Jesus, and to even do the things that he did when it comes to like praying over people, bringing healing, you know, being available to people, having compassion, all this stuff. Those are things that we can still do today. But especially I think as you know, good working Westerners, we're so like busy. Our schedules are so jam packed that to have an interruption is tricky for us. And Jesus was just such a master at allowing himself to open up these moments that maybe were unexpected, you know, maybe even to Jesus. It depends. It gets fuzzy, right? Because he's God, so he can maybe see it coming. But at the same time, nobody else saw it coming. That's for sure. And everybody's bewildered. Like, why, Jesus? Why are you stopping? What? You know, we're on a mission right now. You know, we're trying to get where we need to go, and
There's
Jesus is just willing.
Here,
Exactly. Jesus is just willing to stop and use that as an opportunity to bring love and power to that situation.
All right, last couple of minutes here. I ask you to think about what's a lesson that you learned, and I think you shared a little bit with me, but I wrote down mine and I manuscripted it so I wouldn't wander.
Nice.
All right, good. So here's it. So I said, for me, one of the things that stands out is how many happen, and it kind of goes along with what you're talking about. You know, how many miracles happen to people that are not really connected to Jesus, right? They're kind of on the outside. They don't really happen to the religious, you know, people. In fact, many of them happen to people whom this is their first encounter with Jesus. And that's just kind of strange. It just reminds me of Jesus accepting nature. He didn't reserve his power for those who were closest to them or for those who were living the right way, those that were following the law. In fact, in some cases, it was those who were contrary to Jesus who were not living the life of the Bible prescribes. Jesus doesn't seem to get offended at all by those who reach out to him. In fact, he often highlights their faith. And he says, look, he points it out. He brings it to the front. And he says, this is the type of faith we need, in spite of their lifestyle, in spite of the way that they live, in spite of the fact that their lives don't quite line up with what we may say is what the life of Christ looks like. It looks a little different than that. And I think there's a powerful message in that. And I hope it's one that we have communicated over and over again. Too often the followers of Jesus are more interested in pointing out the wrong that people have going on in their lives instead of seeking to bring healing to their heart. We're so quick to say, well, that's not right, that's not right, that's not right. And that's not the way we should be. What we should be is that we have a God who brings healing to every problem. At the very beginning of this, I said our main point when we talked about why miracles. Here was the main point from Sermon 1 way back in May, right? Seems so way back. It's not really that far back, but we said the miracles of Jesus are a reminder that Jesus is the solution for all of our struggles. That, to me, is so powerful, and I think that's why Jesus interacts with so many people and brings healing to them in spite of the way that they're living. But in spite of the choices that they've made. I mean, one time he has a conversation with a woman who's been married multiple times and is living with a man and won't even get water at the same time as the rest of the people in her town. You know, he seeks that out because it's not about being a perfect person. Get that out of your mind. Listen, I am not a perfect person. Trust me, right? It's not about being a perfect person, but it is about knowing who the perfect person is and coming to him with our hurt so that he can heal it. And I wrote this thought down. I said, we cannot bring healing to anyone's heart that we are also trying to condemn. Those two things are opposite of each other. Healing and condemnation, right? We are not the judge of people's lifestyles, but we do have healing for all of our life struggles, all of our life's difficulties. And if we're more interested in condemning, we'll never get the opportunity to bring healing. And so we need to be more interested in bringing healing. And we know who heals. We've been studying. You know who heals, right? And you believe that he still heals today, right? I mean, I believe that he still does, you know. And that comes from miraculous healing to the kind of healing in a heart that's dealing with doubt and with dealing with fear and with dealing with anxiety, the things that we don't always see on the outside. Jesus still brings healing to those.
Yeah, for me, as far as just lessons from Mark's miracles, it was difficult because there were a lot of really good ones, but I thought about the feeding of the 5,000, and I often say that I always try to find an excuse to talk about the Old Testament, the Tanakh, and because I'm a Tanakh guy, but the feeding of the 5,000 is made to be this parallel to what Moses does in the wilderness for the people of Israel when they're traveling and they're hungry, and all of a sudden Moses announces that there's going to be manna from heaven, and this bread just sort of miraculously appears to help feed them. And the story of Jesus going out into the wilderness and then these people following and Jesus having compassion and bringing them healing is, I think, made to be a parallel account of that. So as you're reading it, you're supposed to be thinking, oh, I remember somebody who did that. That's Moses. And oftentimes the New Testament points out that Jesus is very similar to Moses, and in fact, he's even better than Moses. And so I remember talking about that and thinking about how important it is to remember the things that happen in our history, because through Christ we share that history as well, that God can show up and miraculously provide for us. And then I remember reading, and the thing with this miracle is that it actually happens twice. So it happens with 5,000 people in Mark chapter 6, and then very quickly after that, in Mark chapter 8, it happens again with another group of people, this time 4,000. And the interesting thing about the miracles is that they do happen the same way, meaning that the conversation begins with the disciples coming to Jesus and saying, we've got all these people, they're hungry, what do we do? And that makes perfect sense for the feeding of the 5,000. But then when you go 2 chapters later and you read it in the miracle of the feeding of the 4,000, I was scratching my head. Why would the disciples ask what Jesus is going to do when he just fed more people with less food very recently in their history? And I thought, the disciples, maybe they had like a cognitive knowledge that Jesus could do those things, but when it came to the situation, they didn't stop and remember what Jesus could do. And so we taught in that Sunday about how we need to do the same. We believe that Jesus can do that. He did do all of these things. We were just saying that song that he'll do it again, right? We think of all these things. We remember how Jesus has done all these miracles. We believe that they're true, that what happened in Mark really happened, and that Jesus really is who he said he is, and that he lives in us, and he can do the same thing now. But oftentimes we get faced with a situation, and we try to jump right into it, and instead what we need to do is stop and remember what God has done to bring us hope for the situations that we're going through now. And I think that's so powerful, and it's so easy for me when a situation comes up to just get into like fix-it mode and just dive right in and try to tackle the problem head on, whatever it is. And what we should do instead is stop, maybe pray is probably a good idea too, although Jesus does bless the bread, so I guess we can bring that in for the miracle. But I think what's on display here is to stop and to remember what has Jesus done for us in the past, what do we know that he can do now, not that he's going to do the same thing in every circumstance, right? But we can have a hope that the same God that fed 5,000 people with a few loaves and fishes can provide for us today. Right. And so it's just a great idea to, when faced with that situation, to stop, take a breath, and remember what God has done.
Yeah, good.